Hi, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our panel discussion on parasocial relationships, conversation with 4 authors of real characters. My name is Ken Walker. I am your co-host, and our panelists today are Melanie Green, Dave Ewoldsen, Keith Oatley, and Brad Bond. Our moderator is Karen Shackleford, and I will now turn this discussion over to her. Dr. Shackleford.
Thank you, Ken. As you mentioned, I'm just going to share the names of the co-authors, and each co-author has been asked to give an 8 to 10 minute presentation. So I won't take much time here at the beginning, just welcoming you and saying hello. But I want you to see that we have with us, as Ken said, 4 of the co-authors of the book Real Characters. And we have another session later today, which is a roundtable discussion, which will have more of our co-authors. But I'll just say to begin that I am very honored and thrilled to be here with all 4 of these people, are people whose research that I read voraciously and teach in my classes. So it's an incredible honor and exciting moment for me to be here with them. I will let them speak in turn in the order you see on your screen. And then it should be about time for our Q&A session, which I will start with some comments of my own and then turn it over to questions from the attendees. So before I do that, I will just say briefly that here is hot off the presses, our cover, which our editor-in-chief, Jean-Pierre Isboots, just gave me yesterday. So this is what it will look like, and it is due out from Fielding Graduate University Press, either in the fall or the beginning of the spring of 2021. So with that said, I am going to turn the hosting over to Keith Oatley and stop sharing my screen. And I will just say we're honored to have Keith Oatley be the first presenter today.
Well, okay, thank you so much for inviting us. And this is all very exciting that this issue is sort of taking off. And okay, so I'd like to suggest that the most important research in the 21st century in psychology has been that done by Michael Tomasello and his group. And what they have found is that what makes us different from all of the other animals is that we're enabled to cooperate with each other. And what Tomasello has shown is this occurred during evolution in the last sort of 6 million years or so, when we separated from the chimpanzees, is that this occurred in 2 phases. One he calls joint intentionality, where people make arrangements with each other in the way that we're doing now. And the other he calls collective intentionality. And so here is Tomasello's most recent book. And now, and it's called Becoming Human. So now I'm going to move to my PowerPoint slides, particularly if I can do that. Share screen, yeah, here we go. Yeah. And yeah, like that. Okay. So we've got this little research group in Toronto, which is Raymond Ma and Maya G. Kitch and me. And here's the title slide. And here, I think, is the very central issue to the whole of psychology, that we don't understand the world or other people directly. We do so by making mental models and projecting them onto the world or another person. So, as Kenneth Craik said, when we've got a problem, we translate it into the state of a mental model, and we now manipulate the model to see what will happen if we do this or that. And when we find something that will achieve our goal, then we back translate into saying or doing something in the world. So with joint intentions of the kind that Tomasello talked about, here's the sort of central point: shared goals become more important than individual goals. And so here is a group of us sharing our goal to put on this event today. But to cooperate with other people, we need to understand them and ourselves. So Lorette, Larocque and I asked people to record in structured diaries mistakes that occurred when they made an arrangement with another person. And so each of the people in this arrangement then wrote about what they thought the other person was feeling. And so when the other person was feeling angry, they were 73% correct at that. But when the other person was feeling something else, they were much less good. So there's quite a bit of room for improvement then. So here is the issue about fiction. Fiction from Latin does mean something made, but it doesn't mean that it's been made up. It's based on what we know. So if Amy is angry with Beatrice, we know, and this is a simple mental model, that she's likely to say or do something hurtful. But what fiction does is it puts such simple truths together into complexes so that we can think about what could occur if Beatrice is Amy's 3-year-old daughter, or if Amy and Beatrice have just got together without realizing that the other one was gay. So this is then the issue about fiction. So what we thought then is we would see how much fiction and non-fiction people read and see whether reading fiction enabled people to understand each other better. And so Raymond Marr had this idea, and he was the person who modified a previous test to find out how much fiction and non-fiction people read. So here is a graph of our first results, and you can see that if you read fiction, you are better at understanding other people and better at empathizing with them. But if you read non-fiction, then you get better at that. So if you read astronomy, you get, more about planets and stars. But if you read fiction, you get better at understanding other people. And this effect has now been replicated by quite a lot of other people, and there've actually even been 2 meta-analyses. So here's another of Raymond's results. What he did is to look at all the pieces of the brain in fMRI results about whether they were about understanding other people and whether they were about understanding stories. And these yellow pieces here is where there's an overlap. So comprehending a story involves the bits of the brain that involve understanding other people. Okay, then in the second set of studies, Maya Djikic and I asked people either to read Anton Chekhov's most famous short story, which is called The Lady with the Little Dog, or a control text. And then before and after this, we measured their personality traits and the intensity of 10 personal emotions they were feeling. And then a control text in a non-fiction format, it got all the exact same amount of information and the conversations, same level of reading difficulty, and readers found it just as interesting, but not as artistic as Chekhov's story. And so what we found, as you can see here, is in the Chekhov story on the right here, people changed their personality a bit, but unlike Persuasion, where people all change in the same kind of way, everybody changed differently, each person in their own way. And we found this rather interesting. And so we've replicated this with 8 essays and short stories, literary essays and short stories. And again, when people were reading what they took to be an artistic text, this enabled them to change within themselves in the same way that we found before. So making models of minds includes making a model of our own mind. And so what we do is we imagine ourselves into other people's lives, and this is really where this parasocial idea comes up. So we can think ourselves into the situations of other people. And what we do is we can run the protagonist or another character's plan on our own mental planning processes in the story simulation, and we experience emotions but they're not those of the literary character, they're our emotions in this situation. And so what's so important about this, particularly in the current situation with COVID, is it said, oh, well, you only have one life to live, but that's actually not true, because in fiction, you can live many lives in all these different situations. So as Karen, you know, who's hosting this, has said with her some colleagues, in a story, you can not only feel empathy for a character, but fictional narratives can help someone confront and even resolve personal issues evoked in themselves by memories. And so what she calls this is dual empathy, simultaneous empathy for the character and empathy for the self. So at the very center of our cooperative social lives is how we understand character in relationships by making mental models. And based on this, we can become better at three things: understanding people we know, understanding ourselves, and understanding characters in fiction. And these three can be symbiotic, enabling us to improve our ability at the other two. All right, now I'm going to try and, yeah, there we go. And I've just got a couple of remarks now about this COVID situation. So it turns out that people are quite good at adapting to new situations. And that's what's happening now, so that orchestras are sort of getting together and, you know, playing. Universities are working out how to do courses without having all to be together. People now wearing masks in the street, and even although they avoid to each other, then, you know, here in Toronto, we sort of wave at each other like that. And people in the shops are being so nice and looking after us. But in these kind of new situations, there's going to be mistakes, and, you know, there's quite a lot of those going on. And so here's another issue, which is, I think, tremendously important. Unemployment is terrible, and that's sort of going up. And one of the most important results of the 1930s was done by Maria Hoda and her colleagues in a small town to the south of Vienna, and it had a single employer, which was a textile mill, and it closed down in the Great Depression. And although, for instance, you would think that people with time on their hands would then borrow more books from the local library, in fact, they borrowed less. And they were the first people to invent this psychological idea of unobtrusive measures, which is one of these things. And what happened then, you see, is people were completely demoralized. They felt they were no longer contributing to society. And they were in despair. So being short of money was awful, but this was even worse. And so this is, I think, another very important issue that we need to be thinking about, not just about who's going to get infected and who is not, but how to enable people to feel they're contributing to society. Okay, I think that's all I have to say for now. Okay.
Thank you so much, Keith. And
does that come over okay?
Wonderful. I can hear you loud and clear. And I want to comment, but I will hold my comments and turn it over to Melanie, I think, who is our next speaker.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Karen. And thank you also, Keith, for getting us off to such an interesting start. So, all right. Well, much of my research has focused on stories, and in particular, the way that we get immersed in stories, which we've called transportation into a narrative world. And this is basically what happens when we step into the world of an author and leave our real world behind. So our cognition, our affect, our emotion, mental imagery all become centered around this story. And one of the exciting things that happens as part of or in parallel with this transportation process is these kinds of connections with characters, which is, of course, what we're talking about here today. And research has identified a number of different ways that we can connect with characters. So we can identify with characters when we put ourselves in the character's shoes and see things from their eyes. Or we can have wishful identification, where we really want to be like a character, like that superhero or someone wonderful in a story. And then we also have parasocial interactions, where we come to see characters as friends or sort of interaction partners, even though there's no actual interaction there. We can also like characters, or we can experience what my colleague Shira Gabriel has called narrative collective assimilation, where we just feel like part of a group within a story. So the friends on Friends are like our friends. The students at Hogwarts were part of that team. Okay, and so what I'd like to talk about today is 2 lines of research that look at different ways that these types of connections with characters can influence us. And the first line of research looks at how connections with characters may be related to helping our own well-being. And then the second one looks at how connections with characters can actually inspire us to connect or help with people in our real lives. So the first line of research that I'll talk about is one on rereading or revisiting old friends. And this is in collaboration with Shira Gabriel and Lauren Ministero. And the second one that I'll talk about is about emotional flow and character trajectory. And my collaborators here are Katie Fitzgerald and Elaine Parvati-Harrigan. All right, so what is rereading? I probably don't have to define it for you, but it's the action of reading the same narrative again. Or in our work, we looked at it as an individual difference in people's tendency to read the same narratives over again. And obviously, there are a lot of different reasons why people might choose to reread. So people can reread to gain a better understanding of a text. Or they can reread because there's beautiful language in something that they've read and they want to experience that again. Or they can reread because of enjoyment. Sometimes it's just fun and pleasurable to return to a favorite story. But another reason that we've focused on more in this line of research is the idea of belongingness. So as humans, we're social creatures. We have a fundamental need to belong, a fundamental need to be connected to others, right? And stories can be one way that we satisfy this need. So as the quote here says, we read to know that we are not alone. And in fact, my colleague Shira Gabriel has identified, and her colleagues have identified a number of different benefits that we can gain from what have been termed these symbolic social bonds, these feelings of social connection that come through symbolic things such as stories. So this can buffer us against threats to self-esteem. Something bad happens, it can make us feel better, buffers us against rejection, can help our mood, and just in general, it can fill our social fuel tank. Okay, so make us feel like we've had real interactions and feel better about that, which again, of course, in these pandemic times, I think we are all searching for. And so what does rereading add over just the idea of reading in general? Well, rereading adds an additional layer of safety and predictability. You don't have to worry if something surprising and terrible is going to happen in this story because you know how the story goes. And if you have a group that you connect with or identify in the story, it can also help you feel like you're back where you belong. All right, so in our studies, we've asked a couple of questions. So one is we've looked at who's likely to be rereaders. So what kind of personality variables affect this? And then second, what are the outcomes of rereading? And here's what at least our initial studies, this is a relatively new line of work, have found. So one of these is that rereading does seem to be associated with unmet belongingness needs. So people who have a more anxious attachment style, they want connection but are sort of fearful about doing so, or people who have lower self-esteem, these people are more likely to say that, yes, I'm going to reread books as opposed to just reading new books. And the flip side of that is that when we bring people into the lab and look at readers versus rereaders, rereaders are actually showing higher transportation and higher narrative collective assimilation. So what we see here is that they actually are gaining benefits from this rereading experience. It comes out of a need, but then it's helping to meet that need. So that could be a good thing. And so we have here, rereading can provide this comfort. It can provide this safe and predictable experience that we think that can then help people's sense of well-being. Okay, so connecting with characters can help us feel better. And then a second question is, can these connections with characters actually encourage us to do good things in the world? And to investigate this question, we've been doing some studies that are part of a broader line of research on what's been termed emotional flow. And emotional flow is the changes in emotional experience that happen over the course of the narrative. So this is not from our research, this is other people's, but this is sort of a track of emotions through Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. So you have happy things happening and readers feel good about that, but oh, then tragic things happen and readers feel bad about that. So you have these ups and downs over the course of the story, which of course helps keep us engaged and so on. And one of the emotional trajectories that we've particularly been focusing on is stories that move from negative to positive. So something bad happens in the beginning, but it gets better over the course of the story. And in particular, we've been looking at a story format that's been termed restorative narratives. And these are narratives of recovery after some type of trauma, be it a natural disaster, a personal loss, any of these kinds of things. And these stories, as a key element, have this positive trajectory and also focus on the strengths of the characters. And we think that this trajectory can have a benefit for several different reasons. One is that it can help create empathy for the characters. Second, it can reduce the need for emotion regulation. And then finally, it can simply lead people to experience positive and what's been called meaningful emotions, emotions that have to do with connecting with the meaning of life, so being touched, being moved, those kinds of things. So let's go into a little more detail on some of these. So the idea that a restorative trajectory can increase empathy comes in part from some very interesting research by Ed Roisman and Paul Rosen that suggests that there's a difference between sympathy and what they've termed symhedonia. And this is the idea that it's easier to empathize with someone when something bad has happened to them than it is to feel happy when something good happens to them, especially when we're talking about strangers, people we don't have pre-existing relationships with. So think about watching the news. You hear about someone whose house catches on fire. Oh, you feel terrible for them. You hear about someone winning the lottery. Are you equally happy for them? Maybe, maybe not. Okay, so there's something about seeing people suffering that leads us to connect with them. So these kinds of stories help create connection at the beginning, and they can also help maintain that connection. Because one thing that can happen is if we read too much bad stuff happening, right? Especially if it's not just fiction, but it's in the news, those kinds of things, we can have what's called collapse of compassion. There's too much suffering, so we want to shut down our negative emotions to protect ourselves. But this has a bad outcome. If we shut down our negative emotions, it can also shut down our empathy and helping. Well, we don't necessarily want that. So the nice thing about restorative narratives is they can help people move out of that negative emotion, but still maintain empathy. Oh, something bad happened, but wait, the community's rallying around, this person's recovering, yay, that's great, I feel better, but I still feel connected to that person. And so restorative narratives can actually lead to more pro-social tendencies, wanting to help others in the studies that we've done. So in some, relationships with characters can help us improve our well-being and can also inspire us toward real-world helping. All right, thanks so much.
Wonderful, Melanie. Really, really appreciate that. Excellent. And now let's go to Dave Ewoldsen.
There, I think I have this up.
And Kat Walker reminds me to say that we have a lot of questions in the chat and we're seeing those come through, and we will bring those out in the Q&A shortly. Okay.
Okay, for some reason my PowerPoint doesn't want to start running. Obviously, honestly, I know how to run PowerPoint.
I think sometimes it's just a little slow on these Zooms.
Yeah. First of all, I wanted to start off by saying that I concur with Dr. Oatley that Tomasello's work is outstanding and worth everybody's reading. It's especially his latest work on the ontology of human beings. It is amazing. And maybe this just isn't going to cooperate, and I'm going to do this without PowerPoint. So I'll just talk.
You could maybe touch the slides in the sidebar, Dave. They will still pop up, I think, if you wanted to do it that way instead of projecting. If anyone has any other.
Yeah, I've been doing this for months and haven't had any troubles with this. First of all, I wanted to acknowledge the co-author on the chapter, Sarah Grady, but I also wanted to acknowledge Neha, Etsky, and Josh, who are graduate students who are also working in the lab on the stuff on RII. Gee, this is just not working for me. I don't know what's going on with my computer. Just the PowerPoint has froze. So I will stop sharing. So I had a nice picture there that was why I started studying RII. And it goes back to the 1970s. And it's a picture of Gandalf from The Lord of the Rings holding a lightsaber. And that was something that I engaged in the 1970s, where after I saw The New Hope, I essentially reimagined all of the Lord of the Rings. I went through all of them, moving stuff from Star Wars into the Middle-earth context. And let me tell you that Gandalf with a lightsaber more than holds his own against a Balrog. But it was something that was very interesting to me, and it's also something that, with the exception of Dr. Oatley's work, that we've largely ignored in the study of narrative, and his work on simulation is the other work I think that's been looking at this. So a couple of years ago, Mike Slater and I started looking at what we call reflective imaginative involvement, or RII. And the idea is what is it that people do with narratives when they're not directly engaged with that narrative? And that's what we've been interested in looking at. And the research is contextualized within two theoretical frameworks. One is Bucel and Bolanczyk's work on mental models, and we draw quite heavily from that. And then Slater and colleagues' work on T-bots. And so, in agreement with Dr. Oatley, I think mental models are a critical part to understanding narrative. And one of the things that we tend not to think about with that is that when I'm done with the narrative, when the credits run on a movie, the mental model doesn't disappear. It's still there. We can remember things, and we do remember engage in narratives quite a bit, and that's what we're looking at with this. And so the original scale that we developed and published a couple of years, 2018, so this is fairly new work, focused on reflection on characters. And partly that was because what we were looking at that time was several scales related to characters. So we were developing a parasocial scale for characters versus a parasocial scale for actors and so forth. Since then, we've expanded the model to add two more layers of complexity to it. One of them is, sometimes, like what I did with The Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, I will dynamically play with these mental models of the narratives, and I will combine them, and I will change, and I'll do simulations like what Dr. Oatley has been studying. And the other times, I will just try to recall statically what happened. So like my sons and I will statically recall scenes from Monty Python and try to reenact them. And so we added another layer talking about RII that involves dynamic change versus static remembering. And then instead of just focusing on actors, what our research suggested to us is that there's three different things that people tend to focus on engaging in this reflection. One is obviously characters. A second are events that happen within the stories, and we'll change those events or we'll remember them and so forth. And then the third one is backstory, which actually surprised me. But when you think about fan fiction, a lot of fan fiction involves backstories to the narratives that we're engaged with. And so we were very excited about finding that. The other thing that we've been going over in our research and talking about is, and the graduate students really enjoy this part, is what a moron I was calling it the reflective imaginative involvement scale, because in fact, is this always reflective? Because, I mean, think about it today with the world that we have where, we have Star Wars that stretched across 30 years. in between those movies, I would dare say that a lot of us engaged in RII about what is it we think is going to happen in the next one. And we now call those fan theories. And to me, fan theories are nothing more but RII, but are asynchronous with the text and tend to be more predictive. And for example, I would do a thought experiment with you. If I were to say that I heard earlier today that Tarantino was going to do a new movie, and that the new movie has Harrison Ford and DiCaprio in it, and it's going to be a Vietnam War movie, and it's going to be coming out in the summer of 2022, I dare say that most of you would probably engage in RII about that movie. Again, not reflective, because we have nothing to reflect on, but more anticipatory engagement in it. So if it's going to be a Vietnam movie, is it going to be like Inglourious Bastards? Is DiCaprio going to be like the character he was in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood? How the hell does Harrison Ford fit with Tarantino? He's just not the actor you would put with Tarantino. But again, our argument is that we engage in a lot of these simulations, and our work now is suggesting that's the case. And my final slide, I think, was going to be, but I don't have it, so I probably skipped a slide in there too, which means hopefully I'll get done early. But was where is it we think this research should go in the future? What is it we want to do with it? Because like I said, our first paper on RII was published 2 years ago. Now, obviously, Dr. Oatley has been doing a lot of work in this area prior to that. And it's stuff that I think is very highly related to the ideas that we're talking about. But one thing I think is obviously is what are predictors of RII? And so, for example, transportation is obviously a very important predictor of RII. Within our work on T-bots, we find that boundary expansion is probably the best predictor of RII that we have. But what are the various things that predict when and who and what type of RII are people going to engage in? So when am I more likely to be dynamic and change the story versus when am I more likely to be static and not change the story? And then also, what are the consequences of engaging in RII? So can I engage in dynamic RII to increase the meaningfulness of a text? Because, yeah, it was a pretty meaningful text, but if this had happened, oh my gosh, this would have been amazing. And so that's one of the other things we're interested in looking at. Also, we think that RII probably plays a small role in the development of parasocial relationships, where we're imagining things that we would do with this character and so forth. Other things that we've been wanting to look at in relationship to this is why is it that we engage in RII? It's so easy now to get new stories. You know, I can just pick up my cell phone and I can be watching a movie just like that. So why would I think about old stories? And part of the reason we think, drawing from the T-bots framework, is that old stories have helped us. I mean, T-bots argues we engage in narratives to help us with need fulfillment. And if I have a narrative that I've already engaged with that helped me particularly with need fulfillment, so it made me feel very autonomous when I watched this movie or I read this book. When I have a need for feeling autonomous, why not be engaged in a story that we know already fulfills that function for us? But even more so, drawing from self-determination theory, another one of the three primary goals for people is competence. And we would argue that simply engaging in dynamic RII, and I would argue that most of the time when people engage in dynamic RII, they think they've improved upon the story. Well, what better way to boost your competence than to say, hey, I just took Tarantino's movie and made it much better. Look at how competent I have to be. And so we think another function, I mean, we think these do a lot of helping people with need fulfillment. The other things that we're very interested in is sort of, you know, what is the role of RII in future fan behaviors? Because, for example, I think that RII plays a critical role. I mean, I think fan fiction is essentially RII taken to the extent that we write it down. Somebody just posted, what is RII? Reflective Imaginative Engagement. Sorry, I keep going back to my acronym. But we're also interested in, you know, in cultural studies, they talk about texts are polysemic, and texts tend to be polysemic and are open to multiple interpretations. And we're interested in, you know, as we have stories that unfold across time, so we have all the different Batman movies, and Batman being one of my favorite characters. Does the RII, does my reflective engagement with Batman across time influence then how I read new movies? And there is in fact work in cultural studies that does suggest in fact that that is the case. So for example, people who tend to engage much more in the Dark Knight Batman showed much greater appreciation for the last trilogy of Batman movies, for example, and seem to have read, so it influenced both enjoyment, but we also think it influenced how they read the film. So I guess essentially more than anything is I think there's a lot of research to be done in this area, and what is it that we do with narratives outside of the time when we're actually engaged with the narrative. And now I had a nice slide that said thank you with a really snarky Han Solo picture, and you'll just have to imagine that. You'll have to reflect upon that and imagine it in your as you go on. But thank you.
I think we can all imagine Han Solo. I'm doing that right now. Chewbacca is one of my favorites. I can't make the noise because it's complicated, but so if anyone else can, we can do that later. Okay, thank you, Dave. And we're going to switch over to Brad now.
Yes, thank you. I have to say that when the pandemic started, first outbreak in the United States in January 2020, and the term social distancing became part of our shared lexicon, my immediate thought turned to our relationships with media characters and the classic debate in parasocial literature over whether our connections to characters complement our social networks or compensate for a lack of relationships that we have in our real social networks. And in fact, it was over a Zoom call with friends that when the Zoom call ended, I turned to my partner and I said, oh, I miss them so much. And he turned to me and said, let's watch an episode of Fleabag, you'll be fine. And it was then that I realized I need to be studying parasocial relationships during social distancing. And that's what I did. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about. So I actually have some very preliminary data tracking people's friendships, their closeness of their friendships and how they engage with their friends, and the closeness of their most close parasocial relationships and the engagement with those parasocial relationships over an 8-week period during social distancing. And some of the findings are what we would expect, and some of them are really quite interesting in terms of how social distancing as an idea, as a concept, as a way that we are currently living our lives in routine, may be influencing our relationships. So I want to share that with you. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Make sure this works. Okay, so like I said, the design of the study kind of stemmed from social distancing and the fact that this term is now something I certainly do not have to define for anyone in this room. Social distancing has become part of our vocabulary. It's how we understand our interactions with others. And I was really intrigued to see how that might be influencing our relationship. So what I did was put together a longitudinal panel survey. And we asked individuals to report on their relationships with their real life close friends and their closest characters or celebrities with whom they feel like they have a parasocial relationship. The first wave of this data collection started between April 7th and April 20th. So our very first participant completed the questionnaire on April 7th. That, according to Washington University, was actually the date that the United States was at its lowest mobility. So using GPS tracking and things of that nature, the United States mobility was down 53% on April 7th, which is actually when we had our first participants complete wave 1 of the study. At all 4 waves from April through June, we measured individuals' face-to-face social engagement, so how often people were communicating with their closest friends. Mediated social engagement, how often they were communicating with their closest friends through mediated channels such as social media, instant messaging services, apps, text messaging, and telephone calls. And then how often they were spending time with their favorite characters, the closeness that they feel to those favorite characters, using classic scales of parasocial relationship strength, and their overall media exposure. I then interspersed other measures that we were planning to use to look at moderation really throughout the 4 waves to kind of relieve potential participant fatigue. So we asked about demographics and cohabitation at the beginning of the study, their kind of need for belonging and need for social interaction in wave 2. And we also measured social anxiety and attachment style. Basically, my argument for looking at the need for social belonging and social interaction and attachment style was that a global pandemic is likely to potentially have influence over people's real life relationships and their connections to characters through these types of variables. So if you have a very strong need for belonging and you are an extroverted person who needs to be around others, and now you're being told that your city ordinance or local government or medical professional is telling you that you cannot be within close distance of those people you care about, that might influence both your social relationships and your parasocial relationships. So this survey garnered about 323 responses in wave 1. By wave 4, we had attained 166 participants. So we had about a 40% attrition rate on this particular study. When we look at the data, there's some interesting things happening here. So this is just coding the people that were determined by the participants as their favorite in terms of what kind of genre that they fit into. So nothing earth-shattering here, but I had undergraduate coders look at the individuals that were reported as favorite characters or celebrities. And in this particular study, we actually asked individuals to report their 4 closest parasocial companions and real life friends. And then the analyses that I did were composites of those 4 relationships, which is somewhat unique, at least to the social scientific parasocial literature, where oftentimes we ask individuals to report on their favorite character or celebrity and then ask them scales about the strength of those connections. So in this particular study, I actually measured that connection with their 4 closest real life friends and parasocial friends. In coding those individuals, film and TV actors were by far the most common. Musical artists, personalities would be people like television news anchors, celebrity chefs, people of that nature. Fictional characters, social media influencers, athletes, politicians, and business leaders rounded out the people that individuals reported as their parasocial relationships. I really put the slide here to remind myself, to share with you that there were some things that I looked at here in the data that are absolutely typical of parasocial relationships, which kind of speaks to the hopefully kind of generalization of the sample, and that there was a gender difference such that males were more likely to report parasocial relationships with male characters or celebrities, females with female characters or celebrities. There was a racial difference here as well, in that racial minority individuals were more likely to select favorite media persona who were also racial minorities as opposed to white participants. So we saw a lot of things that we would expect in terms of people reporting their favorite media characters that relate back to homophily and similarity and identification and things of that nature. The sample itself reported approximately 9 hours of media exposure a day, which is actually a little under current estimates of how much time we spend with media in a day. So they're not spending more time than at least what current popular press type of publications and white papers suggest individuals are spending time with media. So in terms of inferential statistics, I took a look at the predictors of engagement. So that is how much you're actually engaging with your friends and your parasocial friends. And this is what predicted those variables at time 1 in the data set. And what you can see here is that there is a consistent finding that there is a racial difference. And given that race was dichotomously coded here, that basically suggests that white participants reported more face-to-face social contact, mediated social contact, and parasocial contact during social distancing, and a need for social interaction, excuse me, also predicted all 3 of these outcome variables. That is face-to-face interaction with friends, mediated interaction with friends, and parasocial engagement. What I then did was controlled for how often you communicated with your friends face-to-face through media and your favorite characters and looked at time 2, time 3, and time 4 to see if there were changes that we could look at that existed above and beyond your previous report of how often you engage with these characters. And the only variable that sporadically predicted an increase in engagement was a need for social interaction. So this desire to be engaging with other individuals. More interestingly, in my opinion, are the analyses that look at closeness. So we look not only at how often you engage with those individuals, but how close you feel to them. The analyses that looked at social closeness, so these are your real life friends. What you're looking at here, each column would represent one wave of data collection. So there were 4 waves of data collection. And at wave 2, we started to control for social closeness in the previous wave. So even controlling for how close you feel to your friends at time 1, we see that at time 2, mediated social engagement is related to social closeness. This actually nicely fits with several theories. A lot of Carolyn Haythornthwaite's work on media multiplexity, and this idea that we use different modalities to engage with people who we already have strong ties with. So if we aren't allowed to engage with individuals face-to-face, we will find other ways in which to engage with those individuals. And in fact, mediated social engagement is related to how close you feel to your real life friends, even when we're controlling for your closeness that you had previously reported. A few other things to note in here that I found rather interesting is that face-to-face social engagement has a rather strong negative correlation to social closeness at time 1. That is negative throughout the course of the study, but falls to non-significance by wave 2. And what I'm at least arguing might be happening there is that if we're actually engaging with our friends face-to-face during social distancing, we're doing so in such a way that we're standing 6 feet away. We have facial protection on. Like these are not our typical social engagement behaviors. So if you do decide to meet up with your friends in a park or to head to an outdoor restaurant, that engagement isn't meeting our expectations. And so in terms, we actually saw a negative correlation between face-to-face social engagement with your friends and how close you feel to your friends. In terms of our parasocial closeness, what we find here is that parasocial engagement is related to your parasocial closeness over time. So again, the more time you're spending with the character, the more likely you are to feel that character is close to you. What I found really interesting here is that social anxiety also predicts this, but only at times 3 and 4, which is also when our mediated social engagement, that is time we spend talking to our real life friends via technology, predicted our closeness to our parasocial others. And what I ended up doing, don't have time to get into, but we can in Q&A if you want to. What I ended up doing was looking at some latent growth curve analyses to actually look at growth over time of parasocial closeness. And those growth curves actually find that parasocial relationships were the only one of these variables that grew over the course of the 8 weeks. So our friendships were maintained over the 8 weeks, but they didn't grow. They weren't influenced negatively either. But our parasocial connections actually grew over the course of those 8 weeks. And that growth was related to not how much time we spent with our parasocial others, but how much time we spent with our real life others via mediated means. That is a particularly interesting finding to me, because what I'm at least arguing is potentially happening is that if we are engaging with our real life friends only through screens in a time of social distancing, then our parasocial friends, right, are reaching a new level of authenticity, because these are the same ways that we are actually connecting with our real life others. So when we remove the social presence or the social cues that we might get from face-to-face interaction, that traditionally has been what interpersonal scholars has argued sets parasocial relationships apart. We can engage in those types of interactions now with our real life friends. So in turn, that type of interaction that we're having with our friends online might actually be influencing our ability to develop close relationships with fictional characters and celebrities. So I could talk forever, but I will leave it there so that we can open up Q&A for everyone.
Thank you so much, Brad. Very interesting, and congratulations to you for getting that in here during the pandemic. It's a dicey time, so actually I have many ideas of stuff to do, and then I think I can't do that. Speaking of which, I'm going to make just a few comments on some of the ideas that were raised here today and a few comments on my chapter in the book. And then I see we have lots of questions that have been rolling in the chat. So I will ask a few questions of my colleagues, and then I will ask for Ken's help in sifting through some of the questions that have been coming in and the ones that will continue to arrive. So first of all, I want to make the comment that we're talking about relationships with media during the pandemic and other global crises that are happening right now during a very stressful time. And it strikes me that I feel a lot of gratitude at this moment, because normally I would be in Chicago for a 10-day session with Fielding. I didn't say this at any point, but I'm a professor at Fielding Graduate University in the Media Psychology doctoral program. And we have what's called a hybrid model, which means they're all graduate students, and we meet face-to-face periodically, and then we do the rest of it by Zoom. So we've kind of been having the experience of everyone else is joining us on Zoom when I've worked at Fielding since 2009, so that's been sort of how we do that. So presence, we study it, and we're sort of being part of that media presence. So if the pandemic hadn't happened, and I don't want it to have happened, but it did, and so, but I'm sitting here with you guys in this meeting room, so I'm very grateful for that. So there are all kinds of silver linings. I keep trying to tell myself that, to keep myself going. But so I want to talk a little bit about some things that I'll touch upon. So the book is called Real Characters, and each of these participants has written or co-authored a chapter. And as I mentioned, there'll be a session at 1 Pacific / 4 Eastern where we'll have more authors just doing more of a casual Q&A. But I'll say some of the things that that I may write about in that chapter, and then ask the panelists some questions. So one thing that I go back to, and who knows why a particular scholar is so interested in one set of facts over the other, but I have been highly influenced by Matthew Lieberman's book, Social, Why We Are Wired to Connect. And it is just one of many ways in which scholars have made the point that we're incredibly social creatures. He's a neuroscientist, Lieberman is, and so he talks in depth about the fact that we have this default network in our brain, and anytime we're not actively engaged with something, dialing a phone number, doing math problems, writing a paper, that our brain goes back to the default network, and he argues that the default network is social. And so what we're doing is imagining social things. And I want to ask the panelists some questions about this, but I guess my argument is that whether we're imagining social things with our actual family, friends, people we know in the community, or whether we're imagining social things with media characters, there's a degree of imagination in all relationships. I would say, I wrote, while people were talking, I put, there's a degree of imagination in our relationship with ourself. The self is a false construct. It's a social construct. I have a vision of who I am, but God only knows what my blind self is, the things that I don't know, and please don't tell me, because I'll be horrified. And the things that we're constantly projecting to other people that they clearly know about us, and then the things that everybody knows about us. But so so much in life is imaginal. I remember when I first taught social psych, and I was doing a graduate seminar in teaching of psychology, and the night before, 4 of us called each other on the phone. We were like, what is social psychology? Oh my God. But one of the things we agreed upon is, it is all perception. There are construals. So we are construing our world around us. We're telling ourselves stories. And so another work that has influenced me a lot is Leroy Beach and Bissell's book about the theory of narrative thought. And so their idea includes the fact that all of our thoughts are stories. Our individual thoughts are stories, and everything we think, in general, we put it into a story. It's kind of like Gestalt psychology. There are pieces, but we form that into a story. And so we're just prone to think in stories. I like to do lots of fan confessions, because I think there's some shaming of fans. And so I'll say, if I'm sitting around thinking about a fan, someone I'm a fan of, and having a relationship with them, for some reason, I always like to think of myself with Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert, and that they think my jokes are funny. That's my favorite little fan scenario, that Karen, your jokes are so funny, I love it. So I've been enjoying watching Stephen Colbert at home and Seth Meyers at home. But so I am going to write about some of that, and I'll write about also some of the things touched upon here, such as just the concept of what parasocial is. I'm going to get more into that in the roundtable. Is parasocial a good word for it? What are we talking about that we're actually doing? And all the different forms it takes. So we have other chapters about parasocial romantic relationships and such. Who is it that we might have a crush on? I always say that I would like to just have a statue of Thor in my garden. I don't know, it's just Chris Hemsworth is a thing of beauty. So, but I'm not thinking, I'm gonna go to Chris Hemsworth's house and stalk him. I'm just thinking, woo, that's as far as it goes. But so, you know, parasocial romantic relationships, and I will use this to transition into my first question for the 4 authors here, which is that you are a famous researcher in this area, and you give a lot of talks and you speak to a lot of people. I'd like to hear some about what you feel is the general understanding that the public has about our relationship with fictional characters. How do you think lay people construe having a relationship with fictional characters? Anyone can answer that.
Well, I think in general, people sort of underestimate the role of fiction generally. So it's not the focus of our panel here, but they underestimate how much fiction affects their attitudes. And I think it's sort of seen as like, okay, here's some separate category, here's something we do in our spare time. And so I think the potential sort of power or benefit of these relationships is maybe minimized a bit. Like even if people actually do it in their own lives, it's sort of, oh, this is a different category, this is not serious, this is entertainment. That would be sort of my guess on that.
And do you feel like it's still, I think there's some talk about how being a fan is more of a positive social attribute nowadays, where it used to be more something that people get shamed about. Do you think that's sort of an innocent series of thoughts, or is it sort of I'm a little bit embarrassed that I, you know, really follow the Queer Eye for the Straight guys, or whatever, like that I shouldn't be that interested in Spider-Man or whatever it is? Or why do people feel that way, do you think?
Well,
I certainly think,
go ahead. Sorry, beg your pardon. You go.
No, go ahead, Keith.
Sorry. I think one of the things that happens is that by sharing something that's out there in culture, 2 people can connect in relation to this third thing. So if it's, you know, I mean, if you live in, you know, England or France or Italy, then and you're male, then you're going to talk about footballers, right? And so here's a shared cultural object, and so, you know, we've just been talking about movies and so on. And so what this enables people to do is to talk with each other about this this person out there. And as I said at the beginning, what we're doing then, you see, is engaging in making mental models about these people and also the people who we're talking with. And so it seems to me that all these things kind of fit together. So that would be my kind of thought about this. Sorry, Brad, but I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no, you're fine. I absolutely think that you're correct in that there is a certain level of stigma involved, or as you said, shame. I find that really fascinating. I was on sabbatical last year and spent a fall traveling the country, and I interviewed about 106 people about their parasocial relationships. And the number of times that people would start a statement with something like, oh, I'm embarrassed to tell you this, but, or like confirming that what they were about to share was in fact confidential. And it actually made me shift the way I introduced parasocial relationships to remind people that having a connection to a character is not in and of itself pathological, and that this is something that the average person engages in. And I do wonder where that comes from. And I think part of that may actually stem just simply from the history of screen media in terms of how it's been discussed and written about in popular press. The idea of, you know, vast wasteland, right? Television is the boob tube. So if you have some kind of connection to something from that landscape, that might make you less than. But it is something that I have heard from participants at least, and it's interesting to contemplate why.
Yeah, I think, like I say, I do experience sort of both sides. Like, so my husband Lee, who's going to be on the other panel, he is a playwright and screenwriter, and so he teaches people to write fiction. And he's the biggest geek. I think he could win biggest geek in the world competition, for show. But he will be somewhere and have a Doctor Who T-shirt on, and people will just run up to him like, "Who's your favorite Doctor?" So among the geek culture, it'll just be like, oh, he is, you know, he is all that in the geek culture. Because, you know, so I love the show Schitt's Creek. If I found out that you did, I would think you have to be a nice person. Like, you couldn't be a terrible jerk and love the same show that I love. There must be something good inside you. So I do think it's like Keith was saying, we're comparing notes. But it is interesting that sort of, I think you said, Brad, 9 hours a day, and then we have that disconnect between, but it's not, I'm not doing anything unless I was watching Masterpiece Theater or something that I'm going to say, or I was on NPR. Sometimes I once had faculty introduce themselves, and as an icebreaker, they would say something that they enjoyed in the media, and people did sort of apologize, like they wanted to say NPR or PBS. They didn't want to, like, I will tell you all day long, I love Kimmy Schmidt. I think if I were most like some characters, it would have to be Kimmy Schmidt or Hermione Granger. And they're not contradictions, by the way. I am both dingy and smart. So it's that, oh, well, I can't tell you because of that social shaming of, and I think it's, some data was raised during these panels about this, that somehow if I think I'm a friend of somebody, or if I spend a lot of time with the Golden Girls, then maybe I don't have real friends. Or I find that people will say this to me at talks, like, well, you know, that person must not have actual friends because they watch Friends, you know, that sort of thing. So I find this whole thing just endlessly fascinating, how we compartmentalize that. Okay, so I will ask you, I'm very aware that I don't want to hog all of the time because we have people on here itching to ask. So I will ask one more question, which is just, a number of people touched upon this in their talks, but what are you thinking of right now as a researcher and a thinker about how this global situation may be playing an interesting role in people's connections to media characters?
I think Bradley should be the first one to talk about that.
Well, at least this very preliminary analysis of this data set suggests that our characters certainly play a role in, it reinforces what we already know, that our characters play a role in our social networks. Human beings are social creatures. We have a desire to be with others. And I think that when we are involuntarily kept from our real life others, that we find new ways to engage, both with our real life friends and with our parasocial characters. And as I said, what I think is really interesting, I didn't necessarily expect our real life friendships to weaken. An 8-week period is probably not long enough to have a significant influence on how you feel about your closest friends. But we also didn't see media exposure go up or time spent with favorite characters go up. Neither one of those had significant growth over time, but closeness to your favorite characters did, which arguably means that we might not even be spending more time with those characters during the pandemic, but the time we do spend with them is more salient. It's more important.
Let me offer an alternative interpretation, that they're reflecting upon that character in ways that are more need fulfilling.
Absolutely.
So they are spending time with the character, but I think they're spending time with the character in ways that help them. So if I'm feeling a lack of confidence because I can't do things, I'm engaged with that character in ways that fulfill my need for confidence. And I wish I would have thought to start doing that research like you did.
Thank you for doing that for us all. But yeah, Gail Seaver in her chapter writes about parasocial relationships and development. So we could talk about how our needs change over time or how the way we view things change over time. When I was 14, my boyfriend wanted to watch the movie Top Gun, so I saw it about 42 times. And then I watched it when I was 35 and I thought, good Lord, why? Other than the fact of the volleyball with shirtless men, that was still good, but everything else about it was a nightmare. But so, you know, and I once took my kids to see Percy Jackson, the Lightning Thief, and I thought this would be awesome if I were 12 because it would just be right in my developmental lane. So, you know, things can fulfill needs at a certain time. And then this thing that you had been watching before may take on a different meaning in a new situation. You know, Melanie, your data about rereading, it reminds me of a comment that my friend Marco said. By the way, Marco and I, she lives in New York City and I live in North Carolina, but we've been meeting to do yoga. My yoga community was very important to me, my face-to-face community. And now my good friend from college and I are having that via Zoom, so it's interesting. But when we were chatting, she said that she's re-watching things and she is kind of loath to watch something that she doesn't know how it's going to end. And that made sense to me psychologically. It seems to be, you know, consonant with what you were saying you were finding in your data. Do you think that rereading or rewatching thing is something that's we'll find that that's been happening during the pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question. And unlike Bradley, we didn't leap on it to collect data, but I wouldn't be surprised because one of my own personal experiences was I started a novel, which ended up being a really good book, but unbeknownst to me, it involved a pandemic that killed off most of the Earth's population. And it was absolutely the opposite of what I needed to be reading in the highly anxiety-provoking early days of the pandemic. So, you know, at least with rereading, you know, you're not going to have that type of unpleasant surprise.
Well, there's that line between truth and fiction. I have these for things that are sort of dramatizations of real things. Like, I am very confused by the Da Vinci Code. Which parts of that are real? Like, which parts of it should I remember as historical and which are made up? So, but you might then think, wait, did I read that in that book? Or was that a news story? You know, sometimes I have trouble differentiating. One of my favorite quotes from that book about the theory of narrative thought is, a good story is better than the truth. And I really believe that. I think it's very applicable to politics, that if a person tells you a story that seems like a powerful, real thing that could happen, you know, it may appear to be real, or you may accept it because it sounds like something that's real. It sort of has face validity, whereas real life is messy and complicated and maybe not as clear as what we write about in stories. So I think sometimes the story just sells itself, like, oh, I can imagine that happening. That fits with my stereotypes for that. So yeah, that probably did happen. Yeah. Okay, so Ken. Ken says there's 8 minutes. Oh my God, I apologize, people, for controlling the conversation here. So Ken, would you mind sifting through some of the questions and posing some to our panel?
Sure, I'll go up here to the very top. First, a practical question from Anne. She asked, is it possible to get a copy of the slides? And I believe that was during Keith's presentation or right after.
Yes, if everyone gives me their slides, I'll be happy to.
Totally fine with me. I've sent the slides to you, Karen, so, you know, if you send them out, that's totally fine.
Wonderful, thank you.
I know the session is also being recorded, so I don't know how it's accessed later, but that might be another avenue as well. And then a question from Stephanie. She has a question for Melanie. Is there any evidence that rereading stories can calm anxiety, especially in times of COVID? An example that I'm thinking of is, can rereading or rewatching help us feel in control in times of chaos and unknowns, hence easing anxiety for real life unknowns?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say that in general, there's some research that that's one of the things that reading can do. It can help remove us from real life stressors, things like that. With regard to rereading in particular, my guess is that yes, it would. We don't have data on that yet. And surprisingly, the the actual research literature on rereading, it's a surprisingly understudied topic. It seems like. So yeah, my guess is that it would be, but we don't have the firm data on it yet. Of course, if anyone else knows of some, I'd be glad to hear about that as well. But so the answer is probably.
Okay, great, thank you. And then a question from Vicky. This is for, let's see, this was in the middle of Melanie's talk, so I assume addressed to Melanie or anyone. Bibliotherapy, parentheses, narrative/story. Oh, this is just a comment. She just says it's one of her favorite expressive arts modalities. Let's see. Nathan, here's a question from Nathan again during Melanie's talk. I'm curious to know if people affected by fiction, I think he's saying, I'm curious to know if people are affected by fiction differently depending on the type of media they consume, i.e. relating to fictional characters in literature versus fictional video game characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would say there's some aspects of it that are likely to be very consistent across different modalities because, like the panel has mentioned, they sort of deal with fundamental needs of connecting or just the way our minds interpret fictional characters. Video game ones are a little bit different, I think, because when a person is embodying a character, like when you're playing a character, there it seems like it potentially brings in some different motivations. So like some people are playing because they want to be the character, or some people are trying on new identities. So I think you get a little more complexity in those areas, but there's a lot of underlying similarity as well, I would say.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I mean, there's quite a good study that compares people playing a video game where someone's been abroad for a year and comes back and her family has disappeared, and one group of people are asked to pay attention to the technical aspects of the game, and then the other are invited to think about it as them being in a story. And the people who took it in the story kind of way, there's the same kind of effects as increasing empathy and understanding others as occurs with reading and movies, right? So, I mean, I agree that I think all these different media are enabled really to do similar kinds of things in this mode of understanding other people and ourselves.
Great, thank you, Keith. And I have a question. We have a few minutes remaining here. A question from Nathan. Says, I'm curious to know if people, oh, that's the one I just read, sorry. Next one. From Vicky, how can we encourage the literary and theater arts in early education curriculum? Any thoughts on that?
Well, let me say something about that as well. So a parent sharing a book or a movie with a kid, you know, is actually one of the very best ways of engaging with them. And so that is tremendously important, both for the purposes of the child's education and also for developing the relationship between the child and the parent. So that is very fundamental.
Well, I was told by IT that I need to make sure that we stop right at the hour. And I'm very glad that we're having a follow-up panel where all of these guests will come back so we can talk more about this. I cannot thank you enough. This was a wonderful session. And I will see you all again at 1 Pacific, 4 Eastern. Bye.